mean the identity of a people who not only live in Malaysia, but who has accepted the language and part of the culture, at least, of the indigenous people. That was what the indigenous people felt at the beginning. They thought that, as in other countries, the people who came later would accept the culture, the language of the majority and be absorbed or assimilated by them. It is not such a strange thing, because if you look back into history, into the history of Malacca, Penang and Singapore, you will find that the early migrants into Malaysia who are not Malays, they accepted the Malay language and they accepted much of the culture of the Malays. We talk about the Babas and the Nyonyas. They are almost extinct now. But in those days, when the number of immigrants was small and the majority of the people were Malays, indigenous Malays, the tendency was for the small immigrant community to accept the culture and the language of the indigenous people. That is why among the Babas and Nyonyas, we find that they couldn't speak a word of Chinese. They speak Malay, they spoke Malay, and they accept a lot of the Malay culture in terms of dress, for example. Chinese normally wear their own kind of dress, the cheongsam or the samfu, but these Babas and Nyonyas, they wear sarungs, and the ladies would wear kebaya, and they would speak Malay, and they would appreciate Malay music, etc. That was because the community was very small, and it would seem that they were partially assimilated by the Malays. So the question of national identity at that time did not arise. But of course at that time, we also didn't have a country called Malaysia. We had many Malay states, and the people who were migrating to Malaysia, they were not considered as citizens or subjects of the Malay rulers. Nevertheless, they were very closely identified with the country, with the culture of the indigenous people, and they all speak the language of the indigenous people. However, this small community grew by leaps and bounds under British rule. Now the British were not thinking about the problem that would arise when you have a multiracial population. They were interested in building up the economy of this country and making money for themselves. So they allowed an inflow of migrants so big that at one time there were actually less Malays, indigenous people, than the people who came from outside Malaysia. If at that time this country had demanded for independence, we would be like Singapore, where the Malays would make up the minority. And the identity of the independent nation would not be what we see today. Certainly it would not be as diverse as we are today. But in 1929, 1930, there was a worldwide recession, and the rubber industry collapsed, the tin industry collapsed, and many of the migrants went back to their own country. The result was that the Malays, the indigenous people who were in the minority, became once again in the majority, but only a small majority. At the time when we struggled for independence, the Malays make up only about 52% of the population. The rest were either of Chinese origin or of Indian origin. Now, you can imagine how difficult it would be if the Malays tried to assimilate or absorb this foreign immigrant population. It is just impossible. Nevertheless, we thought that if we can have one common language, then perhaps that will bring us together. But what happened, of course, is that each group wants to maintain its own identity and its own school system, its own language, its own culture. And as a result, it is difficult in Malaysia to have a single national identity. Still, we have to make do with what we can do. Of course, we may struggle and try and force people to be absorbed or assimilated with the locals. But the locals, the Malays, the indigenous people are very small in number and is too large. The immigrant population is too large for the Malays to absorb. Now I say immigrant population because that is the origin. I'm not saying that the current Chinese population, Indians in Malaysia are immigrants. But let's accept it, that they came from a country which is called China and India. Yes, I would agree that the Malays too have absorbed foreign elements. Many Malays have Indian blood, many Malays have Arab blood, and nowadays many Malays have even European bloods. There are people who, if they look back into the past, they will discover that they were not totally indigenous. But there is a difference. These people not only blend with the Malays in the country, not only do they accept their identity as Malays or other indigenous people, but they actually speak the language and have the same culture and practices, and also they are all Muslims. Now, the Malaysian Constitution provides that a Malay is a person who habitually speaks Malay, practices Malay custom and traditions, and is a Muslim. If you have those three things, then you become a Malay. Legally you are a Malay, even if you have different antecedents. Your grandfather or your father may be